Well, hello and welcome to another edition of Be Still My Soul. It is wonderful to be back and to share God's word with you today. And we are looking today at Psalm 54. Now, the superscription of the psalm, that is a little bit at the start above the actual psalm itself, reminds us of the setting. To the choir master with stringed instruments and maskil of David, when the Ziphites went and told Saul, "Is not David hiding among us?" Now, the story is found in 1 Samuel 23. Let me recount it to you. David was on the run from Saul, as he was in Psalm 52 and 53. He comes to the south of Judah, so he's amongst his own people, his own tribe, and one of the nearby towns, called Keilah, is attacked by the Philistines. They want to rob their barns and nick their food and leave them to starve. So David and his 600 men who've gathered around him come and save the town from the Philistines and save them from starvation. Now, David might have thought that in light of that, the fact he's with his own people and the fact he's actually saved the town from death, that he will be secure and safe. But word is getting out that David and Saul are fighting. They're in conflict. And people in Israel are beginning to take sides. The Ziphites are from the nearby town of Ziph, also in Judah, also part of David's tribe, and they take Saul's side and report to him where David is. Now, it's one thing to be on the run from your enemies and for your enemies to be against you, but when people from your own tribe, your own community, your own family are against you, that sort of treachery is far worse, far harder to deal with. It makes your life much more dangerous and can bring a far greater degree of disillusionment. So how does David respond? Well, he responds as he often responds, by turning to God and praying. And this psalm is so fitting for that situation. In fact, it's fitting for any Christian who is slandered and rejected by those close to them. If that is you today, then this psalm can help you. It can give you words to say. Now, there's three things that David does in the psalm and three things I want us to look at. I want us to look, first of all, at his prayer, his helper, and his praise. First of all, his prayer, verses 1 to 3. In the prayer, he does two things. He brings himself and he brings his enemies to God's attention. First of all, himself in verses 1 and 2. "Oh God, save me by your name. Vindicate me by your might. Hear my prayer, O God. Give ear to the words of my mouth." David says, I need to be saved. My life is under threat. And he rests in salvation in God, in the name of God. That is all who God is for him, his character, his attributes. He rests himself and leans entirely on God. And he's not here simply concerned for his safety, but also for justice. Because he knows that there's no salvation unless justice is satisfied. Vindicate me, he says. You see, there's a slur on David's character. David is seen as a traitor to Saul, a traitor maybe even to God's people. But second, he brings before God his enemies. He tells God who they are, what they're capable of, and how they behave. "For strangers have risen against me." That's who they are. They're meant to be part of his community, part of his tribe, and yet they behave as if they are foreigners after him. And what are they capable of? They are ruthless men who seek my life. They have some degree of power and strength, and they use it for cruelty to kill one of God's people. They are arrogant. And how do they behave? They do not set God before themselves. They have no regard to God. They are like the fool of Psalm 53 who says in his heart, there is no God. And without God, they're devoid of spiritual and moral restraint. And so David cries out to God. He says, save me, vindicate me, hear me, listen to me. That's how we should pray. When we're feeling disillusioned because people from our own community, our own family are against us. David doesn't just pray though. He calls on God as his helper. You see that in verses 4 and 5. What he does is he now brings God before his own attention. He fills his vision with God and with who God is. He says, behold, God is my helper. David is saying, God is on my side. He's greater than all my opponents and he's on my side. I am okay. If God is on your side, who do you fear? Who could stand against you? What kind of power can stand against you if the creator of the heavens and the earth is on your side? And God sustains his life, he says. He's the upholder. The Lord is the upholder of my life. In fact, maybe a better translation is, the Lord is among the upholders of my life. In other words, David is sustained by God's divine life, and David sees that God is behind all the human help that he receives. David receives a lot of human help, the 600 men who are with him. But he sees God behind it. And if God is on your side, if he's sustaining your life, then no one can succeed against you. No one can overcome you because no one can overcome God. He's sovereign. And David says, God will exact justice. He will return the evil to my enemies. In your faithfulness, put an end to them. You see, David knows that God is a God of justice and faithfulness. He's trustworthy. He will do the right thing. And for God to be faithful and just, evil must be repaid. And God's people must be protected. And the way that God does those two things is by turning the weapons of the enemies of his people on themselves. Their weapons will backfire. There is something about evil that is self-defeating. And God has put that into the world. He describes that in his law in Deuteronomy, where what should happen is if there are false witnesses, then what those false witnesses wanted to happen to the person they witness against should happen to themselves. And God works things out so that's what happens. Evil defeats itself. We see that in the Old Testament in the story of Daniel and the lion's den. People falsely accuse Daniel of standing against the king by praying to his God. And so they trick the king into making a law, and Daniel gets thrown into the lion's den. In the morning, the king comes to the den and Daniel's safe. He's rescued by God, who sends an angel and shuts the lion's mouths. And what happens next? Those who accused Daniel, those who stood against him and tricked the king, are thrown into the lion's den and are crushed. They get what they wanted to happen to Daniel. Evil is self-defeating. We see that at the cross. You know, the devil, through Pontius Pilate, through Judas, kills Jesus. And yet, in killing Jesus, he himself is defeated. Jesus Christ wins the victory over the devil, defeats sin and death and hell through his death on the cross. And we should pray in that knowledge too, that there is no other salvation than God. That God is a God who wants justice to happen, and so should we. And we should want it to happen without any vindictiveness to our enemies. And we should leave the results in God's hands, not try and do anything ourselves. See, David here calls for God's wrath, but he leaves room for God to express his wrath in his own time and in his own way. But finally, we have David's praise at the end of the psalm. With a free will offering I will sacrifice to you. I will give thanks to your name, O Lord, for it is good. David responds with spontaneous praise in response to the Lord's acts of goodness and faithfulness, to the Lord's deliverance. You see, when David sees those things and experiences those things, it leads him to greater praise, to further devotion, praising God for who he is, his wonderful character, and for what he's done, his great deliverance. He sees the Lord as the Lord. The word Lord in capitals is the name that God gave to his people prior to the Exodus. He is the Exodus God, the one who saves his people, overthrows his enemies. He did it back then. And he did it ultimately in the cross of Jesus Christ, defeating God's enemies, rescuing his people, rescuing you and me from sin and from death and from hell and from judgment through the death of Jesus Christ in our place. And we receive that simply by faith, and we respond to what God has done in praise. And because we know that God has done that, we can have confidence in our lives that God is going to come through. David has confidence that God is going to come through. He says that in verse 7, for he has delivered me from every trouble, and my eye has looked in triumph on my enemies. David is saying here, amazingly, that my salvation is so certain, I can be so confident that even though it's not happened yet, I'm going to put it in the past tense as if it's already happened. See, if you know that God is on your side, then he will come through and he will deliver you from every enemy and bring you to his eternal home. And so David, at the end of the song, stands looking at his enemies. He's not gloating over them, but he observes God's judgment on them. See, David knows he will survive, but his enemies will be destroyed. Now, the only way we can pray like this and respond to God in this praise is to keep our vision on God. You see, the only way to keep earthly things, including dangers and trials, in their proper place in our lives is to keep our helper in full view, dominating everything, because that's what God does. Thank you so much for tuning in. Till next week, God bless.